basically no downside, and there's a lot of uncapped upside. It's extremely rare. I can only think of 2 companies like in the world right now, maybe, where this is really true.
Keith Rabois, 58% of the seed investments that Keith contributed to have become over $10 billion companies. Airbnb, DoorDash, YouTube. These are companies he took his bet on, companies you know.
There's very few companies that are iconic. If you're involved in one of those, you do not want to leave that company for a very long time. Vinod taught me, most importantly, the team you build is the company you build. Can you find and recruit undiscovered talent? If you want to be happier, healthier, wealthier, you want more stress in your life, not less. It's incredibly counterintuitive. The company's performance is strong enough and predictable enough that the company's going to be successful, period. That's extremely rare and coupled with upside.
Cool. Yeah. So welcome. Thanks, Keith. Okay. So we're going to go through some Q&A for Keith, starting with his investment background. So obviously you see a lot of these great logos on the screen. So one could wonder, how did you know? What are some of the key ingredients to an iconic company? So maybe you can just talk a little bit first about your investing style. What do you look for when you're backing a company on the seed level?
So I'm what's basically known as a founder-driven investor, which basically means, does this founder have a non-zero chance of changing the world? And if you think about it that way, most people in the world, whatever your industry is, actually can be sports, music, entertainment, any field. The chance that you wake up one day and say, I'm going to be the best at that field, I'm going to reinvent a field, is almost borderline irrational. And technology works the same way. You kind of wake up one day and say, I want to reinvent financial services. I want to reinvent, the supply chain. I want to reinvent payments, whatever it is. It's kind of insane. So the art is, as an investor, is figuring out who is actually insane but has a non-zero chance of actually making this work. And then there's certain things you learn to look for, and then that's basically what you're doing when you're making a seed investment. We have a phrase at Khosla that Vinod Khosla, who founded the fund, taught me when he was on my board at Square, which is the team you build is the company you build. And so then what you're doing as the founder or the founders is trying to replicate constantly the same quality. Patrick Collison once said to me, on stage, that the most important thing you do is the first 10 hires, because each of those 10 hires are going to replicate themselves 10 times. So it's like the founding team with certain traits that have an ability to change the planet and then scale themselves.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you. So Keith and I met at Barry's bootcamp, and he'll talk a little bit about that later, but I basically seeked him out. I was like, okay, this guy's a really good investor. I want to meet him. But actually, it's funny enough, Brian Chesky met Keith through sports as well. So why don't you tell everyone, I remember you telling me this story, but tell me how you met Brian through playing soccer and how everyone didn't see Airbnb, but you did.
Yeah, so Brian and Joe lived in a random apartment in San Francisco with one person who happened to be a soccer teammate of mine named Chris Ordonez. And they were starting this company. It was actually the full name, Air, Bed, and Breakfast. And every time we play soccer, I play with Chris, who's really good, actually, twice a week. He'd say, you have to meet my roommates. You have to meet my roommates. And I'd say, well, what are they doing? And he'd say, well, they're building this company. I'm like, what's it called? And he said, it's Air, Bed, and Breakfast. And I said to him, well, tell them to change the name and then I'll meet with them. Anyway, so I deferred it, unfortunately, for a month. But anyway, and then one day he was begging me on the Sunday to come over and meet his roommates. And I was like, I'm kind of disgusting. We just finished playing soccer. And so I postponed it again. Anyway, I finally show up at their apartment, and Brian sits down, and Joe's there, and Nate's actually there this time, even though he didn't live with them. And Brian just starts speaking for 3 minutes. And it's this monologue. And Brian's pretty intense for those of you who worked with him. And when he gets fired up, he's very fired up. And he goes on for 3 minutes about why Airbnb is going to be the quote unquote eBay for space. It was literally from day one, first slide deck, cover page is eBay for space. So you get a scale of ambition, very clear. And then he shuts up after 3 minutes. And I was like, this is the coolest thing I've seen since YouTube. I need to invest. And I later told the whole company the story many 5, 6 years later, 4, 5, 6 years later. What were those things in that 3 minutes? And I was like, Brian said this, and this, and I had almost no questions. So you can tell really fast when someone has a chance of changing the world. And it was very obvious with that monologue. And yeah, also, I really wish I had listened to my roommate, his roommate. I probably would have been much more successful if I had just listened to Chris. But that said, to show you how controversial this stuff is, after I invested, I told Chris, like, you need to quit your job. He was building a social network for boat owners. And he refused to listen to me. So he no longer works in tech.
Cool. Do you want to tell us maybe one more story of like, maybe you mentioned YouTube, whether it's DoorDash or like any of the other companies, maybe you want to tell the audience about how you knew C-Check?
Yeah, I mean, DoorDash was very controversial too. It was like this magic that no one thought was possible. And there was several startups that were trying to do this. And so the question was like, why would this startup succeed with something that seemed heroically impossible? Like the idea of delivering a universal selection of fresh, fast, on-time food and making money seemed virtually impossible. Fortunately, I had two epiphanies. One collided. Tony was my intern, so I knew Tony. So I was like, well, if there's anybody who's going to do this, Tony can do this. Doesn't mean he would 100% probability, but for the point of, can anybody do this? I was like, okay, well, this is a good shot. And then secondly, this guy, Andrew Mason, who founded Groupon, some of you may remember, had this pithy quote one day when he said, the purpose of an iPhone is there should be only two buttons. I'm bored and I'm hungry. And as Tony walked in with his co-founders into my office and said, here's what we're going to do, I looked at him and I said, first, are you sure? Because it was like a heroic venture. And he's like, yeah. And then I was like, why? And then I said, aha, you're the I'm hungry button. And then like, this could be massive. And so it was connecting those two dots.
Very cool. All right. So before we segue into the why, like what you saw in Traba, like one lecture that I saw you give at the KV CEO Summit, which was pretty impactful, was he gave this lecture on these like bosses that he's worked with. So he's worked for some of the hardest bosses out there, from Peter Thiel to Vinod Khosla to Max Levchin to several others. So Reid, Hoffman, Jack Dorsey. So really like, and then through those bosses led like a lot of great impact. So maybe like tell us something that maybe isn't intuitive to most of us, but something you kind of like learn from these bosses.
Yeah, so each of them taught me different things, and then you collect them because they're all very different people. All have been very, very successful. So, Vinod taught me, most importantly, the team you build is the company you build. And he taught me that when he was on my board. And you sometimes get distracted with technology and design and product and customers. But ultimately, if you have critical density of talent, you can solve all those things. And so remembering from a first principles perspective, that's the team, especially coming from Vinod, who's a hardcore technologist, is really impactful to me. Jack really taught me the value of top-down design-based thinking, like a PayPal, which is somewhat similar to Square in terms of market and product in some ways. Everything was empirical. So learning how to do design-driven thinking, which is the antithesis of empirical bottom-up thinking, was radically important to me. And now I'm actually more of a top-down design-driven operator type person that I spent most of my life in. Reid taught me like how to negotiate in some ways. Like he taught me some very subtle, Reid is a master negotiator. And he taught me specifically the value of time. There's a new dimension like to a negotiation of who cares about each incremental day. And that actually changes your opinion on different terms. And then Peter taught me many things, the importance of, we'll talk about a cult, building a cult, the importance of secrets, the importance of monopolies, like lots of things. But he also, most importantly, first week at PayPal, literally first week, we went for a jog around the Stanford campus. And Peter taught me about the most important thing you can do in building a startup, maybe the indispensable thing, is can you find and recruit undiscovered talent, which has basically been my crusade for the last 23 years.
Great. And shout out to Emma and Dwayne, who has found a bunch of great talent here. So thank you guys. Cool. So let's switch into Traba. So as I mentioned, like as Danny also mentioned, you have led 3 different checks into Traba in our 3 years of existence. So definitely have some big shoes to fill with your track record. But tell like the audience a little bit more about like what did you see maybe at each phase that like led you to believe that you wanted to dump truck more money into the company?
Yeah, that's definitely the Founders Fund model, is like really doubling down and tripling down and quadrupling down in companies with high conviction once you see evidence that they really are working. So each round was different. So the seed round, literally, I looked at a seed deck, which had nothing on it except the industry is broken. The industry is very large, very broken. He worked in the industry, and I'm going to fix it. That was basically the seed deck, simplifying. So you don't have a lot to work with other than gauging this guy. And then later, we actually, before we officially started the company, we had dinner, all three of us, and make sure the matchmaking was great, which turned out to be perfect. But that's it. You're really working with the industry's broken. Why? And it was not intuitive to me. I didn't know anything about light industrial until I looked at the first draft of the deck. And I was like, oh, wow, boom, 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 boom. Oh, this is great. And then knowing that Mike had worked there, perfect founder market fit, which is important sometimes. And then certain traits about these guys that predicted, future success. By the Series A, sometimes when you're building what effectively is a marketplace, you have to spend money, and it's really difficult to get both supply and demand. This was not true at Airbnb, actually, interestingly enough. Airbnb was very uniquely only supply constrained, not demand constrained. And the same thing basically proved to be true here. It could have been the case that the company had real challenges recruiting workers. By the Series A, it was obvious that there was a formula that the company had discovered that workers, if you give them the right opportunities with the right money, the right transparency, and things like instant pay, will flock. And so this was going to be a much easier, that was like the anomalous data. This is going to be a much easier challenge to be successful at than I would have ever guessed, and that 99.9% of the investor world would have. And then the last round, which is very preemptive, led by, actually there's a round in the middle that KV led. You started to see both the replication per city was perfect. Like each cohort of a new market was doing better than the prior cohort. So there's definitely a formula, and you could tell. And then right around then, you could see that the company's growth was accelerating while the margins were accelerating. And those two things increasing. Those two things don't move in tandem almost ever. Like I could probably think of maybe 4 companies in 23 years where the growth accelerates at the same time as margins expand. So that was the anomalous data that said, holy cow, this is special.
Cool. Awesome. Maybe tell the audience a little bit more about FF8 and like what happened with Founders Fund.
Yeah. So I was kind of alluding to this. Like most venture funds raise a new fund every like roughly 3 years or so. So we spend the money, we invest the money over about a 3-year window. Sometimes we run a little hot, like 2.5 years, sometimes 4 years. And then we go raise it. We go back to our LPs and say, here's all the great stuff we've done. Here's all the great companies we've invested in. Here's hopefully some money we've sent back to you. And so at Founders Fund, about 2 years ago, I guess, raised what's called Founders Fund 8. So it's the 8th fund. And at Founders Fund, there's a tradition of investing in a signature company right out of the gate. Like, we're going to find the best, most important company in the planet, and we're going to put our first check into it. And it's going to make our LPs really excited. So a lot of very, very successful companies, you probably know the list, that you all have heard of were signature investments out of earlier Founders Fund. Anyway, so Founders Fund 8 closes, and Peter's like, well, what's going to be our best possible investment to kick off this new fund? So we went through this exhaustive exercise, went through the entire portfolio of like 100 companies or so. And the universal consensus among all the general partners of Founders Fund was to preemptively offer to lead a new round into Traba because it was the best in the portfolio.
Great, and we definitely appreciate it. Just the beginning, so we'll definitely make it worth it. So let's get moving to mafias. So PayPal Mafia, right? We've all heard of that, but there's also been other like density of like a lot of talent that works together at places like Airbnb, DoorDash, Stripe, and then you learn so much by building this company that you actually have what it takes to go launch your own company someday. So want to hear from a member of the PayPal Mafia, like, how do you think about like when the right time is to know that you have just enough learnings that you're ready to go off and do your own thing? And from an investor that sees someone that was like, quote unquote, early Airbnb, early DoorDash, or early Traba, like what kind of like, how do you think about that? What kind of questions do you ask these people?
Well, there's very few companies that are iconic, and you can define that in different ways. If you're involved in one of those, you do not want to leave that company for a very long time. The reason why is there's an order of magnitude difference between an iconic company and a really good one, and then a good one. So, on the prior slide, there's a few iconic companies here. If you happen to be involved in them very early, the worst decision you could ever make in your life is to leave that company until you've exhausted all the possible learnings that you could possibly get. Now, that said, everybody has a rate of growth and every company has a rate of growth. And at some point, every great company starts slowing down. It happens, to all the best companies. And once in a while, they can find their energy again. Like this kind of happened to Microsoft. Microsoft in the Bill Gates days would have been the most amazing place to work. And you would have learned and absorbed incredible lessons from Bill Gates. But if 10, 15 years ago you'd worked there, you probably weren't learning that much. And you probably were watching movies on a Friday afternoon, literally true story in engineering. And so it would have been a great time for someone who has high potential to lead. But while you're in the Bill Gates era, it would have been a disaster. So how do you think about it from a personal perspective? I think about it this way. If you want to start a company, first, you should have a really damn good idea because building a company is incredibly difficult. Every one of these founders, would probably repeat Elon's famous kind of expression of it's like chewing glass. It's really, really hard. And so don't do it unless it's something that you just cannot stop thinking about 24/7. Secondly, the first thing I'm going to do is if you start a company is call Mike and Akshay and ask about how much impact did this person drive at Traba? Like, what are their superpowers? How do they show those superpowers? Did they embrace the most difficult challenges in the company? Did they run to them or run away from them? Those are the people who become excellent founders. That's why I knew Tony, as an intern, was already creating value. You could tell. Like I funded the founders of Fair, both worked for me directly at different points at Square. No brainer. Fair was very controversial as an idea. Basically what Fair does is connect long tail retailers with brands. Everybody, when they started the company in 2015, was like, doesn't Amazon kill all that stuff? And, they had good answers, but fundamentally it was that they were really strong, important people that embraced and tackled some of the most difficult challenges at Square for 8 years. And so it was a very easy check to actually write. So I think that's the most important thing is the bigger the challenge you embrace here, the more success you have, the more likely it is that you're preparing yourself and preparing me for you to be a great founder.
Okay, good answer. So let's stick it out through these challenging years. That's a good segue into stress. So one thing that Keith told me one book he told me to read in the earlier days when I met him was go out and read The Upside of Stress. And it actually aligned with a lot of my thesis of stress. So building a company, as we all know with the Traba Mafia, we are going through a lot of stress and a lot of challenges. It's certainly not comfortable, but it's definitely motivating, exciting. So how do you think about stress, path dependency, a lot of these concepts?
Cool. So yeah, one of my favorite books ever that I've read in my life is called The Upside of Stress written by a professor at Stanford. You can watch a 20-minute TED talk she gives, but the book's actually much better. And the main thesis of the book is at the end of the day, if you want to be happier, healthier, wealthier, you want more stress in your life, not less. It's incredibly counterintuitive. She will answer every possible critique of that statement with incredible evidence. It will transform your life or will transform your friends and family's life if you give it to read. Now, again, like Mike, I sort of believe this anyway. I believed it before I found the book. I just finally found evidence to convince other people. So I like to proselytize, but I actually believe it. Like if you think of stress as a way of challenging your body, the reaction you get, the sweat, even sometimes people throw up like in sports before a game. That's because they know mentally they're challenging themselves to be the best they can be. Like there's a lot of very famous athletes that before like an NBA championship actually throw up in the locker room because they know they have to be at the best of the highest potential people on the planet to win. And their body is knowing that and reacting to it. So it's a good thing. Like they're embracing it and channeling that, saying, I know I'm like not taking it easy on myself. So that's what you want to do professionally. That's what you want to do in any field. And it really does work. But I highly recommend reading the book.
Great. Okay. So last question. So I know you and Samir, our other board member, came around this office after the board meeting, shook some hands, but let's think about like today moving forward, because as you all know, like we're still very much in the earlier days. Like we still have a long journey ahead of us. Like, what are you most excited about with Traba, and how do you think about like why certain members in this audience should throw in an application today as like now being the best time to join?
Yeah, so my partner Samir Kool has been involved in a lot of companies, has been a good VC for over like basically 20 years, and he and I are working together on Traba. And we both walked away from the board meeting and said, wow, the company is like firing on all cylinders. And there's little things you pick up that when you serve on a lot of boards over time. But like basically one is just, is the company accelerating? And that you can see that in metrics, but the financial metrics tend to lag. You can kind of feel it first and see it show up in P&L later. So both the energy, the acceleration, the clarity in communication improves, the breadth of the vision expands, the roadmap gets clearer and clearer to like the $1 trillion. And then secondly, critical density of talent. You wind up accumulating more and more advantages in recruiting people. You have more and more depth, more and more talent, and that becomes pretty stark. And so that was obvious. From a joining perspective, I think Traba's in a very rare spot right now, which is the company's performance is strong enough and predictable enough that the company's going to be successful, period. Like I have literally no doubt about that. Like no footnote. That's extremely rare and coupled with upside. So usually, if those of you know anything about financial assets, you usually have to trade risk and reward. It's extremely rare. I can only think of 2 companies like in the world right now, maybe, where this is really true, where there's basically no downside and there's a lot of uncapped upside. And I just don't know better choices like professionally early in your careers.
Great. Awesome. Well, thanks for believing in us, and we really appreciate you. So thanks.